Should Britain have blasphemy laws? Now you might think that's quite an arcane question, almost a medieval question. But it's relevant now because the Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer, has refused to rule out introducing blasphemy laws after a Labour MP demanded that this government, the Labour government, his government, prohibits the desecration of religious texts, including the Quran. Now, this statement and this request was made during Prime Minister's questions this week when Starmer was challenged on the government's position on blasphemy laws by Tahir Ali MP, who cited the importance and the relevance of Islamophobia Awareness Month as a justification for his call to protect ancient religious texts. Ali represents Britain's second most Muslim constituency, with over half of his residents being followers of Islam. He said that November marked Islamophobia Awareness Month, and last year the UN Rights Council adopted a resolution condemning the desecration of religious texts, including the Quran. But that condemnation from the UN, it seems, has led to Ali expecting the same laws and the same expectations to be brought to Britain. Let's hear what he said.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. November marks Islamophobia Awareness Month. Last year, the United Nations Human Rights Council adopted a resolution condemning the desecration of religious texts, including the Quran, despite opposition from the previous government. Acts of such mindless desecration only serve to fuel division and hatred within our society. Will the Prime Minister commit to introducing measures to prohibit the desecration of all religious texts and the prophets of the Abrahamic religions?
Well, can I agree with him that desecration is awful and I think should be condemned across the House? We are, as I said before, Mr. Speaker, committed to tackling all forms of hatred and division, including, of course, Islamophobia in all of its forms. Thank you.
Now listen carefully. Did you hear Starmer there ruling out introducing special laws for religious texts such as the Quran? I certainly didn't. Many campaigners have reacted very strongly to Starmer's statement during PMQs this week, with their fearing that any new measures could risk clamping down on free speech. Some have said that Starmer's failure to robustly respond to Tahir Ali calling for a blasphemy law was not enough. His failure, they say, to push back on that demand, on that question, could lead to further people probing for and pushing for protections for religious texts. Well, the Prime Minister said that desecration is awful. He thinks it should be condemned. He wants to tackle all forms of hatred and division. But he's not said that religious texts should not be protected by law. Now, Number 10 sources have told GBNews that the government is not considering a blasphemy law, but it has, as we've just said, raised widespread questions about Keir Starmer's commitment to freedom of speech. Well, joining me now to discuss this and more is the political commentator Charlie Downs. Charlie, first and foremost, what's your reaction to that video, that footage from Prime Minister's questions of both Tahir Ali's question, but also Sir Keir Starmer's response?
Well, Charlie, it's great to be back with you. I think there's a number of things that we need to make clear when we frame this discussion about what Tahir Ali has said. Now, he hasn't explicitly called for blasphemy laws. He has called for laws prohibiting the desecration of sacred texts. Now, I don't think anybody is a huge fan of desecrating sacred texts. I think it's quite a tasteless thing to do. Is it an expression of free speech? I think there's a conversation to be had there for sure. But many people have already said that there have been incidents in the UK already, like the one in Wakefield when a very young boy scuffed a Quran and was then his mother was made to apologise and kind of plea with local police and the local Muslim community not to kind of deliver repercussions to her son. So there's already an environment in the UK where there is a certain degree of fear around this topic. The next thing I think that is very important to note is, well, I think a lot of people are viewing this as being a slippery slope, essentially. It's the first step on the road towards actual blasphemy laws. But when Tahir Ali says the word Islamophobia, because he said, of course, this is in the context of it being Islamophobia Awareness Month, he's not using that he's using that word in a very specific way, because the Labour Party have a specific definition adopted from the all-party parliamentary group on British Muslims, defining Islamophobia as follows. Islamophobia is rooted in racism and is a type of racism that targets expressions of Muslimness or perceived Muslimness. Now, the first thing to note on that, of course, is that Islam is not a race. Islam is a religion. Islam is a set of ideas, many of which are political, and many people view Islam as essentially being a totalizing philosophy that has instructions on all areas of life, from economics to politics to individual conduct, and all of these sorts of things. So to frame Islamophobia as being a racist thing is, I think, deeply dishonest, deeply concerning, because it aligns it likens it to actual expressions of real hatred in a kind of arbitrary way. I would also add that the phrase, the word Islamophobia, is itself also dishonest, because it frames criticism of Islam, the ideas, to be clear, as being irrational. When we say phobia, we think of irrational fear. We think of arachnophobia, for example. Now, I would say that when we are looking at the ideas, literal Islam is how I would put it, there has to be space for a conversation to be had. And it's not all irrational. There are perfectly rational reasons to challenge Islam, just as there are perfectly rational reasons to challenge Christianity, to challenge conservatism, to challenge socialism, all sets of ideas. There has to be room to criticize these things.
And Charlie, let's just go back to what Tahir Ali said in Parliament, because he wants measures to be introduced that would prohibit the desecration of all religious texts and the prophets of Abrahamic religions. This goes beyond just books here, because he's also referencing the prophets of Abrahamic religions. Now, Charlie, you mentioned, I think quite fairly, the situation in Wakefield. That woman, the mother of an autistic boy, it said, who supposedly scuffed a Quran in a school playground. He might have just dropped it. And then serious local repercussions followed. A meeting was organised at the local mosque. West Yorkshire police sat there essentially as a show trial took place, and this mother, covering her head, by the way, is sat there and is sitting in front of this crowd of men, explaining to them that her son meant no offence by doing so, and essentially trying to keep the peace and urging calm from people who see any sort of incorrect usage of a religious text as a serious offence that could justify repercussions. That is a really dangerous situation to go on. But again, when Tahir Ali is talking about it, it's not just texts, it's also prophets. So here's another example from that area. The school teacher in Batley, also in Yorkshire. Now, he's been in hiding for years because he supposedly depicted the Prophet Muhammad in a school setting, in a classroom, in front of some school children. That set off serious repercussions, with extremist activists, Islamist activists across the country descending upon Batley in order to protest and seek out this man, who is still, as I said, in hiding. He can't live a public life ever again. His life is at risk because of that. In a sense, Charlie, we already have measures that prohibit the offence of religious texts and the prophets of Abrahamic religions, but it only goes in one direction. If you criticise anything in the Quran, you desecrate the Quran, or if you offend Muhammad or other prophets, you put your life at risk. These measures essentially already exist, and I think it's quite telling when we haven't got Labour MPs or politicians of any stripes really pushing back on this sufficiently, and it will give, don't you think, those Islamists a lot of confidence to have seen Sir Keir Starmer's response, not ruling out introducing those measures, not pushing back on the idea that religious texts and prophets should be protected.
Well, Charlie, I think that this is something that is crucial and that many people, I think, are quite frankly afraid to discuss, which is that in Britain, there exists already a culture of fear around discussing Islam. And that, I think, is because there have been incidents, like the ones you've already listed, where criticism of Islam has resulted in repercussions. And this, I think, is something that the British political system, but moreover, the British mind, is not equipped to deal with, because the British political system and the British mind that it originates in is naturally quite liberal and quite tolerant and quite eager to see the best in people. I think that it's very much part of the British spirit to want to see, to think well of people, to be charitable about people. And so when it comes to having a full and frank discussion about the merits of the proliferation of what amounts to a foreign religion in our country. By the way, the first mosque was opened in 1889 in Britain, which is, historically speaking, relatively recent. And I think that is quite a good place, a good point in history to define as being the introduction of Islam to the British Isles. It's a recent thing, and it has become all the more intense because of decades of mass immigration. We're just not ready, it seems, to have these conversations, certainly in mainstream politics. I mean, you hear certain politicians signaling at least in this direction, but until we are prepared to have a full and frank discussion and be unafraid of the consequences of that, I don't think that this is going to get any better, because when we talk about Islam, a lot of people choose to interpret that as meaning all Muslims. Now, when I say Islam, I don't mean all Muslims. I'm talking about the literal interpretation, the black letter of the Quran and the Hadiths. But in Britain, and across the world more generally, I would say, the Islamic community, the Muslim community, however we want to refer to this group of people, they think of themselves as a group, right? And this is something that I think is quite alien to the British mind and maybe to the European mind more generally, because we are historically quite individualistic in the way that we think of ourselves. I mean, Britain is the birthplace of classical liberalism, which is the ultimate philosophy of individualism. But this is a religion, a philosophy, a political ideology that encourages its followers to think of the group, to think of themselves as representatives of the group. And we saw this in the lead up to the general election when Angela Rayner went to a predominantly Muslim neighbourhood in her constituency and was speaking to what are commonly referred to as community leaders or community elders in the mainstream press about what she's going to offer them, what she's going to offer the Muslim community if elected. So this is a group of people who think of themselves as a group. And this, I think, is crucial to understand, because we, the British, the English, for example, we don't really tend to think of ourselves in this way because it's kind of alien. Yeah. But this is a group of people from a part of the world who subscribe to a particular philosophy, who do think in this way. So I think that is also a really necessary conversation for us to have in mainstream politics. But again, there is this culture of fear around it, and perhaps for good reason, because we've seen what happens when there is criticism of Islam levelled. It leads to repercussions.
Yeah, and Charlie, I think you're right to raise that, because there's a discussion to be had there, is there not, about the power of sectarian politics. And people will be thinking, there's no way that we'll ever have a blasphemy law in Britain again. We're done with all that. Religious texts aren't going to be protected. We're not going to find a situation where offending a prophet of any stripe, colour, creed, whatever, there's not going to be an issue where that's reintroduced to British law. But we're seeing now, I think for the first time in our lifetimes, the efficiency and the effectiveness of sectarian politics very quickly. When there is a block vote of a particular group that tends to vote in one certain way, local politicians, even national politicians, will seek to exploit the wants and wishes of those groups. They'll think perhaps less in the interests of the nation and more in the interests of what those local populations think. We've seen it in Leicester in recent years. The only Tory gain in this general election this year was for a seat in Leicester. I think it was Leicester East, and the local candidate there signed up to a so-called Hindu manifesto appealing to local Hindu demands. So it's by no means just a Muslim or Islamic issue. But when we've also seen on a national scale very senior members of the cabinet like Angela Rayner conducting this sort of behaviour, going along to try and sucker favour, to get that sort of support from a group, essentially, through direct political appeals. There is a risk now, Charlie, is there not, that with that sort of activity going on, sectarian campaigning, that what might have once seemed impossible to return to Britain could do so again. And by that I'm talking about blasphemy laws and the protection of religious texts. If it becomes politically feasible or indeed necessary to appeal for such policies in certain areas in order to get over the line, then why can't it happen? Why can't these laws return?
Which I think there's a few things to say here. The first is, frankly, this is what comes of the project of multiculturalism, where you do have these kind of disparate groups who have not integrated, as a result of mass immigration, organising. Because the key thing to understand about politics, to quote the great Italian political theorist Gaetano Mosca, the organised 100 will always defeat the disorganised 1,000. So the question is not one of quantity. It is one of organisation. And these are groups, as we've been saying, whether it's the Muslim community or the Hindu community, or even going beyond that, the Black community, the Scottish community even. Let's go there. These are groups that are organising. They are organising around a group interest. They are organising around a common cause, and therefore making inroads into the political system, because that's how you get stuff done, regardless of what political system you live under nominally. I mean, we live under so-called liberal democracy, but this is the case in all political systems, regardless of what it calls itself. It's always the case that organisation is how you get power, because no individual man can get power by himself. You need a team, you need a network of people, all of whom are pointing in the same direction, working towards the same goal. And we are seeing that in real time with this kind of sectarianism that you're talking about. Once again, until we are prepared to have grown-up conversations of this nature, I think this is only going to get worse.
In this specific example of sectarian politics and the risk of blasphemy laws, when you look at what Keir Starmer said in the House of Commons on Wednesday, when he said, we're committed to tackling all forms of division and that desecration is awful, do you think he gave what many critics would say was a mealy-mouthed answer that failed to actually respond to those demands? Do you think he gave that answer precisely because of what you're describing, the demographic nature of how Britain is drawn up, the problems that Labour has had with the Muslim vote in the last year due to the situation in Israel, Gaza and Lebanon, etc., and indeed Yemen and the whole Middle East, really? Do you think he said this weak response because he fears those demographic drivers and those potential democratic risks to him? And if so, imagine that those restrictions weren't in place and those demographic risks weren't there. What would you have wanted Keir Starmer to say to that question?
Well, let's not forget that British Muslims tend to vote Labour. En masse, on average, they tend to go for the Labour Party. So I think there is an electoral component to this, which is that Keir Starmer doesn't want to alienate this particular community, and he did struggle with it.
Any more than he already has, because already.
Which is the point. He during the election, part of the reason that Angela Rayner had to go and have this kind of struggle session with the Muslim community in her constituency was because of how he has approached the issue of the war in Gaza. Many British Muslims have been very unsatisfied by his response to what's going on over there. So I think that's one part of it. I do think another part of it is just him recognising the demographic reality of the United Kingdom, and also the fact that, once again, this is a community that is very, very keen and very, very able to organise around its group identity. We've seen that already in our country. So I think he probably fears that happening if he doesn't concede that this kind of thing. But I think another component of this that has to be understood, disabusing our minds of liberal fantasies as we should be, is that it's my belief that all regimes in all times and places have what amount to blasphemy laws. There are always things in all societies, it's a perennial thing, that are off limits, right? Whether that's by cultural and social enforcement or by legal enforcement. Because for a long time in this country, there were things you weren't allowed to say.
Yeah, and we're just as good at censorship. We're just as good at censorship as others. There's no unique strand of Englishness that prevents it.
Well, this is the key point, is, people like to think of Britain and England as being the birthplace of the concept of free speech. And in a certain way, it is. Like, the idea that we hash our ideas out as a substitute for violence, I think is a very British idea, and it's a very good idea. It's a very noble ideal. But the idea that you can just say anything you want, say everything in all times and places, there has never been a state where that has been the case. There are always laws, again, whether actually written down in the books or enforced in an unspoken way socially. There are always laws about what you can and cannot say.
So the question is just, what is it? The question is just, who do you want to write those laws?
Exactly, Charlie. The question is not whether, but which. The next question is not whether we're going to have these kinds of laws. It's about what they're going to prohibit. And if that is the question, I don't want to see ultimately what amounts to what I would call a foreign religion like Islam take centre stage. I would prefer it if we had a governing class that was prepared to put the interests of Britain, British history, British identity, British culture first, because this is Britain. I actually look, for example, at a country like Israel, okay, where the government is explicitly pro-Jewish, right? The reason, the governing philosophy of Israel is Zionism, which is the philosophy that Jewish people deserve a homeland, and that homeland should be protected and governed in a way that is explicitly, specifically, and unashamedly in the favour of the Jewish people. Now, I believe that philosophy is completely legitimate. I think and I think, moreover, bringing it back to our situation, that those are the lines along which Britain should be governed as well.
Saudi Arabia does the same thing. Saudi Arabia wants its country to be organising the interests of its faith and of its people.
Because that's not a controversial idea. For the entirety of history, the state has been understood, like the first duty of the state is to protect and secure the future of the people of the nation. Like that's not some kind of crazy idea. But in the post-war paradigm, ideas like that have become uncomfortable for a lot of people because they think that kind of politics is just one step along the road to the events of the middle of the 20th century. And I don't believe that that's the case at all. I think that it is the duty of the governing class, because all societies, again, have leaders. You have to have leaders in society, and the duty of leaders has to be to the people of the country, protecting, securing their welfare, their well-being, their future. And our government does not govern along those lines, and is, again, as we're seeing in this example with Tahir Ali and Keir Starmer's response to him, not prepared to stand up for and unashamedly say, no, we're not going to do this because this is Britain, and our first concern is with the British.
Yeah. And just to be clear, in the same scenario, you wouldn't expect Keir Starmer to stand up if a Christian MP said, "Oh, let's protect the Bible and let's protect key figures from Christian religious texts." You wouldn't expect Keir Starmer to stand up to that and say, "Oh, well, desecration is terrible and we can't be doing that." Are you more confident that in that scenario he'd stand up and say, "Blasphemy is a thing of the past in this country, we won't have those laws again"?
I am certain that if a Christian MP stood up and said the same things, that Keir Starmer would condemn it. I think he would say that it was a bad thing, because Christianity is not a particularly fashionable religion in the West anymore, despite
it's more than that, though, Charlie. I think it's more than that. It's not just fashionable. It's more that you can criticise it without your life being at risk. It's the fundamental difference, perhaps. So in Europe, there are people who do desecrate the Quran, set fire to it, or whatever. And this is particularly an issue in Scandinavia. It's been an issue. Let's think about Charlie Hebdo in France, in Paris, that satirical magazine. Many of its leading workers and artists and journalists were slaughtered in that attack preceding the Bataclan massacre in 2015. And after that, we did not see a sort of Europe-wide civilizational reaction in favour of free speech, crushing any sort of perspective that criticising Islam or criticising Islamic texts should be a death sentence, because that's just not what should happen in Europe. But it is. There have been people who mock religious prophets, people who've mocked the Quran in Scandinavia who've been assassinated. There have been issues in Denmark, particularly around this. It's a cause of great controversy even there. But if you did the same to the Bible, right, no one cares. No one cares. And I think the trick of satire is always to prod the things you're not allowed to prod, right? And always to push those limits and to have that humour and to have that fun with freedom of speech and to mock whatever you want to mock. Nothing should be off limits in that sense. I know, Charlie, you said that every society's got their own blasphemy laws. But the problem that Europe's got now is that your life's at risk. Your life's at risk if you criticise or desecrate or offend in a certain way. Perhaps that's the key reason as to why Keir Starmer did not react sufficiently to Tahir Ali. Maybe he, like many others, fear for their security should they do so. Many MPs, it's worth noting, during the last general election raised significant security concerns due to the pro-Gaza protesters, many of them turning up at the houses of MPs to demand they vote a certain way. Lots of people being stopped in the street and heckled very aggressively. I'm sure there are more things that the security service and parliamentary security haven't shared. But this is a problem, right? This is a problem. This is a violence issue. And for Tahir Ali to be asking a question about protecting these texts and protecting these prophets, surely surely there is an understanding in this country that when he's doing so, it comes in the context of the risk to life, not only to artists and satirists, but also teachers like the man in Batley.
Yeah, well, these are all crucial points that you're raising here, Charlie. I think part of the reason that we haven't seen a more organised reaction to certain expressions of Islam across Europe over the last 25 years, let's say, is because, again, it's what I was saying before, Europeans, we've been essentially, as far as I'm concerned, brainwashed out of thinking of ourselves as a group. Because, you know, organising around collective European interests, I think, again, has, you know, it's viewed as dangerous, basically, and it's taught as being dangerous by the schools and by the education system. And so there is a reason that we haven't nipped this kind of thing in the bud already, because that is really what we should have done long ago. It's been, you know, we're far too late to the party.
Well, Charlie Downs, it's been a pretty disturbing conversation, I think, as often our chats are, because it feels as though with that question and the reaction from Sir Keir Starmer that blasphemy laws, once considered in modern Britain to be a thing totally of the past, are once again not being treated with the same level of scorn as they were until very recently. The desecration of texts and the offending of certain religious figures could be gaining political momentum. Their protection, not allowing that to go ahead, that facing measures of legal repercussion. It was raised in the Parliament this week. It didn't get the pushback it expected, that many people expected there to be sent from Sir Keir Starmer. He just appeared to move along, not answer the question. He did not condemn the question, which is what many people would expect in a liberal and free society, condemning any call for the prohibition of the desecration of texts or the prohibition of the desecration of prophets. But that's what happened. Sir Keir Starmer decided not to respond forcefully to that. Well, political commentator Charlie Downs, thank you very much for joining us on GB News today for this Originals discussion. I'm Charlie Peters. You must subscribe on YouTube because many more of these are going to be coming out soon, and I'll catch you at the next one.